Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is the weekly teaching for Saturday, October the 8th, weekly teaching number 49. And I want to talk to you about understanding the will of God today. And this is built on what we've been talking about the last few weeks. I've sort of tried to resurrect words like save and salvation. And then last week talk about how God saves our soul daily as we do His will. I read to you from Ephesians 6, where Paul said that we as slaves as Christ ought to do the will of God from the heart. And of course that was just a huge part of what Jesus came to do, was to take the Old Testament and show, first of all, his nation Israel, and then secondly, all the surrounding nations, the Gentiles, how to take that word and apply it to our hearts. And he showed us what life would be like. We would live a life of love for God and for neighbor. And remember, Jesus said in John chapter 4 to his disciples, I have food to eat that you do not know about. My food is to do the will of him who sent me. My food, my nourishment, my sustenance is to do the will of him who sent me. Well, the will of God is reflected in his commandments. So when we do his commandments, we're doing his will and we're nourishing our souls. That's what we were designed for. That's when we are operating at the peak of our powers, at the very best that God created us to be. So if we want to experience that daily salvation, then we need to focus on doing his will, doing his commandments. We read also from Romans 2 last week, where it says that there's tribulation and distress for every soul that does evil, but glory, honor, and peace for every soul of man who does good. To do good is to do the will of God, is to keep his commandments. Those are all the same thing. God's will is reflected in his commandments. And if you think about it for a minute, if his will was one thing and his commandments were something separate, we'd be hopeless trying to figure out what his will is. His will is reflected in his commandments. That's what he wants us to do. His will for us is that we keep his commandments. So that leads to the question, well, what are his commandments? What do we do? Well, that takes my mind to something that happened in the last few weeks, which, when it happened, it really troubled me. It really took hold of my thinking, and I've thought about it a lot since then. It has to do with this transgender issue that has come up all over the country, and specifically in North Carolina with what they call the bathroom bill. And specifically, and I'm going to read to you from an article here. This is from World Magazine, but there were articles in many magazines about it. Transgender bathroom debate. Barack Obama cites the golden rule in Matthew 7:12 to defend policy allowing boys in girls' bathrooms. So let me read to you excerpts from that. But before I do, I'll just read Matthew 7:12, which says, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. So in other words, Jesus is saying, if you take all the law and the prophets, this is how you would summarize it. All the law and prophets would include the 10 Commandments, would include the Great Commandment, and everything else. He said, when you sum all that up, what that comes to is treat other people like you want to be treated. So that passage, Matthew 7:12, is often called the Golden Rule. It says in this article, U.S. President Barack Obama has cited the biblical Golden Rule to defend the controversial federal guidance he issued in instructing all public schools to allow transgender students to use the restrooms of the opposite biological sex or risk losing federal funding. Speaking at a town hall meeting in Elkhart, Indiana on Wednesday night, he said he was inspired by the Golden Rule, which Jesus Christ himself spoke of in the Sermon on the Mount. During the meeting, the president was asked why, with all the pressing issues you have before you right now, why is the issue of which bathroom to use such an issue? And then he said, somehow people think I made it an issue. I didn't make it an issue. He said that he was compelled to issue such a policy because schools are asking us, the Department of Education, for guidance, How should we deal with this? Well, maybe he wasn't the one that raised the question, but he was the one who instructed the federal government to threaten any school district with loss of federal funds if they didn't do what he thought they ought to do. So he goes on to say that he has a profound, quote, a profound respect for everybody's religious beliefs on this. I don't see how he squares that with his position. When you say to people, look, you either do it the way I am saying to do it, or I'm going to take all your money away from you. Or at least I'm going to take enough money away from you to really make you hurt, if not go completely out of business. Many schools would just fold up completely. So how that manifests a profound respect for everybody's religious beliefs on this, I don't know. But he thinks it does. He says if you're at a public school, the question is, how do we just make sure that transgender children are treated with kindness? As you know, my reading of Scripture tells me that the golden rule is pretty high up there in terms of my Christian belief. So this really troubled me because I read that and I thought to myself, Lord, how can this be that here's one man, this happens to be the President of the United States, but he's a man and he's saying that he reads your words and they say, they tell him that he's supposed to tell everybody where to go to the bathroom. And I read those words and I don't see that in there. Now, let me call that article back up because I want to, it continues on. It says earlier on Tuesday, I forget when this was, let me see when this was written. This was published in June of this year, so several months ago now. So around that same time, he issued his 8th annual proclamation calling on Americans to celebrate diversity and observing June as LGBT Pride Month. So 8 times annual, so he's done it every year he's been in office. And he said, since our founding, America has advanced on an unending path toward becoming a more perfect union. The fight for dignity and equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people is reflected in the tireless dedication of advocates and allies who strive to forge a more inclusive society. They have spurred sweeping progress by changing hearts and minds and demanding equal treatment under our laws, from our courts, and in our politics. So, from his point of view, the golden rule, however you want other people to treat you, so treat them, what that means in his mind is everybody should be treated equally. Everybody should be treated the same. And if you think that boys whom God created to be boys should be going to the boys' bathroom and girls whom God created to be girls should be going to the girls' bathroom, that you are violating the golden rule. Now, he said somewhere in there that he thought other people might have a different interpretation, but as I pointed out to you, he's not allowing for that. He says he respects it, but you're going to pay through the teeth if you don't do it the way he thinks that it ought to be done. And I know he's not the only one who thinks that. He's speaking for a lot. He wouldn't be saying that if he didn't think he had either the majority or either the majority of the people in the country or else the majority of the people in power in the country who occupy positions of power, whether in government, media, business, entertainment, whatever, news. So the thing that troubled me, as I said, I was asking the Lord, how can this be? How can this be? Here, okay, he says he's a Christian. I say I'm a Christian. He says that he thinks the golden rule is pretty high up there in importance. I think the golden rule is pretty high up there in importance. We both think that, and yet he looks at it, and he thinks that tells him to do what he's doing, which is to, number one, legitimize and, in fact, honor the L's, the G's, the B's, and the T's, not make any distinction there, but treat them the same way you would treat people who weren't L's, G's, or B's, or T's. And I look at it and say, no, I don't think that I think I want to treat people like I want to be treated, and I don't expect to be treated in in that way. In other words, if I'm deluded, if I think something that's wrong about myself, if I think I'm a woman, then the way I would want other people to treat me is to talk me out of it, to get me help, to do whatever, to get me therapy, or to shake me till I come to my senses. I don't want them to enter into my delusion and support my delusion. That would not be loving me. That would not be treating me the way I want to be treated. But again, I'm not so much focused here on the right or wrong of that. I'll get there in a minute. But all I'm focused on is the fact that how can it be that two presumably sincere men can see something so very differently? And I came to a place of understanding when I realized that he's being very selective with the Bible. In other words, if all you knew about this Bible, if you read that verse, the Golden Rule, and said, okay, that's what it sums up, so I don't need to read any of the details. The details can be left to somebody else. The point is that however I want other people to treat me, so treat them. And this is the way I want everybody to treat me. So if that's the case, you wouldn't need to read any of the rest of the Bible. And that's a problem, because in that same part of the Bible, Matthew 7, that's the third chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount runs Matthew 5 to 7. Well, in chapter 5, Jesus says this. He says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder." Now that's quoting one of the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not commit murder, or thou shalt not kill. "And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and therefore remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you're on your way with him, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent." So Jesus is saying, okay, in the Old Testament it was thou shalt not murder. Now he's saying, take it to heart. Remember what we said, doing the will of God from the heart. Take it from the heart. Don't even murder anybody in your heart. In other words, don't murder anybody spiritually. Don't hate them. Don't denigrate them. Don't put them down. You say, somebody might say, well, isn't that what you're doing with President Obama? Aren't you putting him down? No, I'm not putting him down. I am calling out a difference. I mean, I would say this to him face to face if he'd see me, but he won't see me. And I understand he can't. He's got lots of people. I'm not saying that he should make time. There's over 300 million people in the country, so I wouldn't expect him to see me. But he's a public figure. He's making public statements, and so I'm making public statements. And he's got his position. I've got my position. It doesn't mean that I demean him as a person. It just means I disagree with him, just as he disagrees with me. So the point is, if I hate him in my heart, if I hold grudges against him in my heart, God will see that, and God will hold me accountable for it. But all I'm doing here is trying to find out the truth, to identify right and distinguish it from wrong. So then Jesus goes on to say, he goes on to take another of the Ten Commandments. He says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So just as Jesus took the commandment, do not murder, applied it to the heart, and made it much more demanding, keeping all thoughts out of the heart that are anything like murder, So he does the same thing with adultery. Not only is adultery wrong, but even contemplating adultery, thinking about adultery. A man's thoughts should be about his wife only. And so he's taken these commandments very, very seriously. And this is just 2 of the 10. Well, for people like the president to take just the summary statement that I read, the golden rule, and say, okay, that's all I need to know. I don't need to know any of the detail. It throws you off on what the summary statement means. If you don't look at what builds up to the summary, then you're misunderstanding the summary if you ignore everything that built up to it. And in that same sermon, Jesus said, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven." Think about that. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments, one of the least. Well, I wasn't reading the least when I was reading do not murder and do not commit adultery. Those weren't the least. Those were 2 of the top 10. But whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So what the president and people who think like him are doing is they're annulling some of the least of these commandments, or some of the, not least, but some of the commandments, in order to press this golden rule thing. And then I realized, well, okay, if that's what they're doing, then the golden rule can mean anything you want it to mean. It can mean however I want other people to treat me. Well, okay, I like running around on my wife. I don't think there's anything wrong with somebody running around on their wife. So I'm going to run around on my wife. I'm treating other people like I want to be treated. I'm not condemning them for something. Well, no, you got to go back and read that you can't run around on your wife, even in your mind. And that's what Jesus expects. But if all I ever read was the golden rule and I didn't read any of the rest of that, I might not get that point. And that's what's going on. Our society is so biblically illiterate that a public official can stand up and say, hey, we need to treat everybody the same and not discriminate. If people are biblically illiterate, they'll hear that and they'll go, yeah, that makes sense. But that's because they're so ignorant of the commandments that Jesus gave. And what it ends up doing is it takes us back to a time, and I'm looking in here for the last verse in the book of Judges, because it described that time there, and it describes our time today. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's what's going on today. I mean, America used to be, well, you can argue whether or not it used to be a Christian nation, but it used to be much closer. What can't be argued is it used to be much closer to a Christian nation than it is now. And everybody's just doing what's right in their own eyes. And whenever anybody calls them on it and say, well, you shouldn't be doing that, they say, well, I'm just treating other people like I want to be treated. I don't think there ought to be any laws about sex, so I'm being consistent. I'm not being hypocritical. Well, there's more to it than that. If you're going to do the will of God, you got to study this, which is why I've been spending some time the last few days on the daily blog trying to deal with different commandments, especially from the 10 Commandments. No other gods, have no other gods before me, and what that means. And then do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, and so on. Because to teach the commandments of God is to teach his will. And the more people understand his will, the more they can do it. And the more they can do it, the more their souls will be saved. The more they'll find peace in their soul. So that's the point I wanted to make today. Commandments of God reflect the will of God. When we do the will of God, we experience the saving of our souls, which should increase our peace day by day. It says in Isaiah 9:7, there will be no end to the increase of his government or its peace. So as we increasingly come under the government of Jesus, that is embracing his commandments as they apply to the heart, then the more our our peace increases. But we've got a hunger and thirst for righteousness. We've got to know what it is that he's saying, not just selectively pick, okay, this golden rule thing, that sounds pretty good, because I really don't have to change a whole lot. I can just basically say it's okay for other people to do what they want to do, and that makes it okay for me to do what I want to do. No, that's misusing Jesus' words. So remember Jesus. He is Lord. I'm not Lord. The President of the United States is not Lord. Nobody else is Lord but him. And we have his commandments, and he teaches us how to obey him. He obeyed them. He wants us to do the same. They add up to love, but you can't be committing adultery against your wife and then go around saying, yeah, but I just love everybody. No. We've got to keep his commandments. That's doing his will. God bless you.